Chapter 1. The night everything changed. That night started like any other. The sound of rain tapping against the diner windows, the soft hum of the neon sign outside, and the faint smell of old coffee mixed with the sweetness of lemon pie. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels both peaceful and heavy, like the air is waiting for something to happen. I'd been working the late shift at Luna's diner for almost 3 years. Same faces, same orders, same routine. The truckers, the night owls, the drunks trying to sober up before heading home. I'd learned to keep my smile steady, my eyes kind, and my thoughts hidden somewhere no one could reach. But that night he walked in. He didn't belong there, not in this place, not among the broken neon lights and the smell of grease. He was wearing a dark coat, rain still dripping from the hem. His presence filled the room in a way that made everyone else disappear. He didn't even have to speak. You could feel that he wasn't like the others. He took a seat in the back corner near the window. Didn't look at the menu. Didn't take off his gloves. Just sat there, his eyes scanning the place as if he were searching for ghosts. And maybe he was. We all are in some way. I walked over with my notepad, trying to ignore the strange pull in my chest. "Coffee?" I asked. He nodded, barely looking up. "Black." His voice was deep, calm, and tired, like someone who'd been through too many nights without sleep. I poured the coffee, placed the cup in front of him, and turned to leave. But then, for just a second, our eyes met. I can still remember that moment, how time seemed to pause, how the air between us grew heavier. There was something in his gaze I couldn't explain. It wasn't attraction. Not yet. It was recognition. As if part of him already knew something I didn't. He stayed there for almost an hour, not saying another word. I wiped tables, refilled salt shakers, cleaned the counter, but I kept glancing back at him. Something about him made me uneasy. Something about him felt familiar. When he finally left, he placed a $50 bill under the cup and walked out without a sound. No name, no goodbye, just the quiet echo of the doorbell as he disappeared into the rain. The next night, he came back, and the one after that. Always at the same time, just after midnight. Always at the same booth. Always the same order, black coffee and lemon pie. At first, I told myself not to notice. People come and go. But he wasn't like the others. He didn't flirt, didn't complain, didn't even check his phone. He just watched the world as if he were waiting for it to end. Sometimes, when the diner was empty, I'd find myself sitting across from him, making small talk I didn't expect to enjoy. "Long night?" I asked once, just to break the silence. He gave a faint smile, the kind that hurts to see, because it looks like it took effort. "The longest," he said. That was the first time he smiled, and it was the first time in years that I felt someone truly saw me. After a few weeks, he started to feel like a ghost that belonged there, a shadow that blended into my nights. I never asked his name, but I overheard one of the other waiters whispering it after he paid his bill. "Moretti," they said. "Luca Moretti." The name felt like a spark in the back of my mind. Familiar. Dangerous. Something I had read or heard a long time ago when I was too young to understand. Later that night, after my shift ended, I went home and sat on the floor of my tiny apartment, the rain still falling outside. I opened the old wooden box my mother left me, the one I hadn't touched in years. Inside were photos, folded papers, and one newspaper clipping yellowed by time. The headline read, "Moretti family under investigation after disappearance of young girl." My hands trembled. There it was again, that name. Moretti. And there, in the photo beneath the article, stood a man who looked almost exactly like the one sitting in my diner booth every night. But that couldn't be him. That photo was at least 20 years old. And yet, his eyes were the same. Cold. Haunted. Unforgettable. The next night, when he came back, I couldn't stop staring. Every movement, every breath felt heavy with questions I couldn't ask. He noticed, of course. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said softly. "Maybe I have," I replied. He smiled again, that tired, tragic smile that made me wonder what kind of life could carve lines like that into a man's face. There was something different about him that night. He looked less like a stranger and more like a secret, one that had waited years to be discovered. I remember pouring his coffee, my hand shaking slightly. I remember wanting to ask 1,000 things. Who he really was, what brought him here, why his name haunted my memories. But instead, I said the only thing I could manage. You always come here alone. He looked down at his cup. It's easier that way. Easier than what? Easier than remembering. His answer sent a chill through me, because I knew what it was like to run from memories, to bury pain so deep that it only comes back when the world gets quiet. That night, when he left, I followed him outside with his receipt. It wasn't an excuse. I just needed one more look, one more piece of the puzzle. He turned toward me under the flickering neon light. For a moment, the rain stopped, the air went still. He looked almost fragile, like someone who'd lost everything and stopped believing in second chances. I handed him the receipt. You forgot your change. He took it, his gloved fingers brushing against mine. The touch was brief, but it was enough to make my heart skip. I don't believe in change, he said. Not the kind that matters. And then he was gone again, disappearing into the rain, leaving me standing there with a strange ache in my chest and too many questions in my mind. That was the night everything changed. I didn't know it then, but the man I just served coffee to was the reason my mother spent years hiding. He was the reason I'd grown up with fear instead of family. And somehow, fate had brought him right back into my life, sitting in my diner, drinking his coffee, completely unaware of who I really was. At least for now. Clapperboard Chapter 2, Shadows Behind the Smile. After that night, I told myself I wouldn't think about him anymore. People come and go, I reminded myself. The diner was full of passing stories, half-finished conversations, faces I'd never see again. But somehow Luca Moretti stayed, not in the booth in my mind. Every night, at exactly 12:30, the bell over the diner door would chime, and he'd walk in, brushing the rain off his coat, always calm, always quiet. He never looked rushed, never distracted. It was as if time belonged to him, as if the world waited for his permission to move. He always sat at the same booth by the window, the one where the neon light from the sign outside painted his face in red and blue. I'd pour his coffee before he even asked. He'd give a faint smile, nodding in gratitude, and then he'd watch the world through the glass, like a man who didn't quite believe he was still part of it. I started to notice little things about him. The way his hands were always steady, except when he lit a cigarette, then they'd tremble just for a second. The way his eyes softened whenever he looked at me, but hardened again when anyone else came near. And the way he always positioned himself so he could see both the door and the back exit. It wasn't paranoia. It was training. This man had lived in danger long enough to expect it. And for some reason, he was hiding in my diner. One evening, when the rain had stopped and the city felt strangely quiet, I decided to sit down across from him. It was late, almost closing time, and there was no one else around. You always sit here, I said, pretending to wipe the table. Why this booth? He looked at me for a long moment before answering. Because from here, he said, I can see everything that matters. It was a strange answer, the kind that stays with you long after it's spoken. Then, after a moment, he asked, What about you? Why do you work here this late? I smiled faintly. Because it's easier to hide at night. He nodded, as if he understood more than I'd said. Silence filled the space between us again, the kind that isn't uncomfortable, but heavy with things neither of us wanted to admit. That night, after he left, I found myself staring at the window where he always sat. His reflection lingered in my mind, like a ghost that refused to fade. I thought about the article I'd read, the name Moretti printed in bold letters, the story about a missing girl and a family tied to crime and power. My mother's voice echoed in my head, her warning whispered in the dark when I was little. If you ever hear that name, Sophia, you walk away. You run, and you never look back. But I couldn't run. Not now. Something inside me needed to know who he really was and what he had to do with me. A few nights later, I noticed something I hadn't before. When he reached for his coffee cup, his sleeve slipped back, and I saw a scar on his wrist, a deep, curved line, shaped like a crescent moon. My breath caught. I'd seen that mark before. It was in the photo from my mother's box, a man holding a baby girl, that same crescent-shaped scar visible on his wrist. The caption beneath the picture was from a crime article dated 20 years ago. The man in it was listed as Luca Moretti, under investigation. It couldn't be a coincidence. It was him. My chest tightened as I tried to steady my breath. The man who'd walked into my life wasn't a stranger. He was a ghost from a story I was never supposed to uncover. But I couldn't confront him. Not yet. I needed to be sure. Over the following week, I began to observe him more closely. His gestures, his words, even the way he reacted to certain songs that played on the old diner radio. Once, when an old Italian tune came on, I saw his eyes close for a second, as if the melody hurt. That was the first time I saw the man beneath the silence, someone broken, carrying guilt too heavy to speak of. Sometimes, when the nights were long and empty, we'd talk. Not about him, not about his past, but about small things. Books, music, places we'd never been but wished we could go. He had this way of speaking, slow, thoughtful, as if every word had been weighed before it was set free. I remember one night he asked, "Do you ever think about starting over?" I smiled sadly. You can't start over when you don't know where you began. He looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment, I felt like he could see every lie I'd ever told myself. But the truth has a way of crawling closer, even when you try to keep it buried. One night, a group of men came in, all dressed in dark suits, their eyes sharp, restless. They sat in the far corner, but their attention wasn't on their food. It was on him. Luca noticed too. I saw his hand slip into his coat, not pulling anything out, just making sure something was there. A weapon, maybe. A reminder that danger never truly leaves. When I brought their drinks, one of the men leaned toward me and said quietly, "You should stay away from that one. Men like him don't bring peace." I froze. When I turned to look back at Luca, he was already watching us, his jaw tense, his eyes colder than I'd ever seen them. The men paid and left shortly after, but the silence that followed felt like a storm waiting to break. That was the first time I truly felt afraid, not of him, but for him. After that night, he stopped showing up for a few days. The booth stayed empty, and the diner felt heavier without him there. I told myself it was better that way, that maybe he left for good. But part of me missed the quiet comfort of his presence. Then one evening, as I was closing up, I saw a black car parked across the street. The engine was running, but no one got out. The next night, it was there again. And the night after that, I started to wonder if someone was watching me or him. On the fourth night, when the car disappeared and the diner went silent, I turned off the lights and locked the door. But as I stepped outside, I saw him, leaning against the brick wall, his coat soaked in rain. "Sorry," he said, his voice low. "Didn't mean to scare you." I crossed my arms, pretending to be calm. "You disappeared." "I had to," he said. "Some ghosts don't like being found." That was when I realized he wasn't just running from something. He was protecting himself. Or maybe protecting me. As he walked away that night, I noticed something. He dropped a folded napkin on the counter before leaving. I opened it later, under the dim kitchen light. One word was written on it, "Sorry." Just that. Nothing more. And yet, that single word carried everything. Regret, loss, warning. I didn't know what it meant yet, but deep down, I knew that the moment he walked into my life, nothing about it would ever be ordinary again. Because Luca Moretti wasn't just a customer. He was the key to a story that began long before I was old enough to understand it, and the truth waiting behind his eyes would either save me or destroy us both. Clapperboard Chapter 3, The Man with No Past. Narrated by Sophia in first person. He came back on a Wednesday night. I remember it because the city was unusually quiet, as if even the rain had decided to rest. I was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door rang, that soft chime that always seemed to echo louder when he was the one walking in. He looked different that night. Tired. Haunted. The shadows under his eyes were darker, and his hands, always steady, trembled slightly as he pulled off his gloves. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. But then he looked at me, and that was enough. The same cold fire in his eyes, the same heavy silence that made me forget how to breathe. I didn't ask where he had been. I just poured his coffee, placed it in front of him, and said, "You look like hell." He smirked faintly. "You should see the other guy." I laughed, though it wasn't funny. His lip was split, and there was a bruise along his jaw, half hidden by his collar. I wanted to ask who had done that to him, but something in his expression warned me not to. It wasn't fear, it was exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes from living too many lives and trusting too few people. So, instead, I just sat across from him. For the first time, he talked. Not much, not enough to make sense of anything, but enough to make me realize there was a whole world behind that silence. He told me about loyalty, about betrayal, about how every person he had ever trusted eventually sold him out for something cheaper than truth, money, power, survival. He didn't mention names, but his voice carried the weight of graves. Then quietly he said, "When you've done enough bad things, people stop seeing you as a man. You become a story, something they whisper about in fear." I looked at him for a long moment and said, "Maybe you just need someone to remember the man, not the story." He stared at me like he wanted to believe that, but couldn't. The more he spoke, the more I understood why he came to the diner. It wasn't the coffee, or the pie, or the quiet. It was the only place where he could pretend to be human again. No bodyguards, no guns, no ghosts, at least for a few hours. Sometimes he'd sit in silence, and I'd watch his hands tracing invisible lines on the table, as if drawing maps of a past he couldn't escape. And sometimes, when the air grew too heavy, I'd change the subject, ask about books, places he wanted to visit, songs he liked. Little things that made him smile again, even if only for a heartbeat. He told me he liked the sea, not because it was peaceful, but because it never stopped moving. "It forgives nothing," he said, "but it hides everything." And I understood. He wasn't just talking about the ocean. Days turned into weeks. I told myself that what I felt for him was curiosity, fascination maybe. Nothing more. But late at night, when I closed my eyes, I could still see his face, hear his voice, feel the quiet between us. The truth was harder to admit. I was beginning to care. I didn't want to. I couldn't afford to. Because every time he looked at me, I saw the shadow of a man I was supposed to hate, the man whose name was written in the same ink that stained my past. And yet, the more I tried to stay away, the more I found myself drawn back to him. One evening, after closing, I stepped outside and found him waiting near the alley, leaning against the wall, smoking. He looked at me and said, "You shouldn't walk home alone at this hour." I crossed my arms. "And what makes you think I can't handle myself?" He smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him. "I don't doubt that. But sometimes trouble finds you even when you're not looking." I don't know why, but something about his tone felt more like a warning than concern. We walked together in silence for a few blocks. The city lights flickered above us, and the sound of rain began again, soft but steady. He stopped in front of my building and said quietly, "You're too kind for a world like mine." "And what world is that?" I asked. He looked at me, his eyes darker than the night behind him. "One where kindness gets you killed." He turned to leave, but I stopped him. "Luca," I said softly. It was the first time I'd ever said his name out loud. He froze, then looked back at me. There was something raw in his expression, like he hadn't heard his name spoken gently in years. "Be careful," I whispered. He nodded once, then disappeared into the darkness. And that was the moment I realized something I wasn't ready to face. I didn't just care about him anymore. I was afraid for him. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about everything he'd said, about the bruises, the scars, the way he watched every door and every shadow. I pulled out my mother's box again, the one I'd promised myself I'd never open twice. I studied that old newspaper photo, Luca holding a baby girl in his arms. My mother's handwriting on the back read, "He took everything." My throat tightened. Could it be true? Could this man, the one sitting in my diner, the one who smiled when I brought him coffee, really be the same monster from my mother's past? But if he was, why did he look so broken? Why did his eyes carry more sorrow than guilt? And if he had taken everything from us, why did he make me feel like I was finally being seen? I wanted to hate him. I wanted to look at him and remember the pain, the loss, the fear. But every time he spoke, I heard something else beneath the surface, regret. Real regret. The kind you don't fake. So I made a decision. I'd keep pretending. I'd let him come, let him talk, let him believe I didn't know who he was. Because maybe, just maybe, if I got close enough, I'd find the truth my mother never told me. Who was Luca Moretti? The man who ruined my family. Or the man trying to escape the ruins of his own. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But that night, as I stared out the window and watched the rain blur the city lights, I realized something terrifying. Ours wasn't just beginning. It had already started years ago, long before I ever knew his name. And now, there was no turning back. Clapperboard Chapter 4, The Dinner Invitation. Narrated by Sophia in first person. It had been almost 2 months since the night Luca first walked into the diner, and by then, he had become part of the place, like the flickering neon light or the hum of the old refrigerator. Every night at 12:30, he'd come in, sit in the same booth, and order the same coffee and lemon pie. And every night, I'd tell myself to stop caring. And every night I'd fail. But that evening was different. He looked lighter somehow. Still serious, still guarded, but his eyes carried something softer. Maybe relief. Maybe exhaustion. I couldn't tell which. When I brought his usual order, he looked up at me and said quietly, "You ever get tired of this place?" I smiled. "Every day." He nodded, thoughtful. "Then come with me tomorrow night." I froze. "What do you mean?" He leaned back, watching me carefully. "Dinner. Somewhere quiet. Just somewhere that isn't here." It wasn't the kind of invitation that came with charm or expectation. His tone was simple, almost vulnerable, like a man who had forgotten how to ask for company. I hesitated. My heart was already beating too fast. I didn't trust him, not really. But there was something in his voice that made me want to see the man behind the mystery. So I said yes. The next night, he picked me up in a dark car that looked too expensive to exist in my neighborhood. He was wearing a black suit, no tie, and the faintest trace of cologne that smelled like smoke and rain. We didn't talk much during the drive. The city lights passed by in blurred streaks, and for a while, it felt like we were two ghosts just floating through a world that wasn't ours. He took me to a small restaurant by the river. Candlelight, soft music, the sound of water outside the windows. The kind of place that didn't match who I was, or who I thought he was. When the waiter brought our food, I could barely taste it. I was too busy trying to understand why a man like him, someone who carried so much danger in his silence, wanted to share a quiet evening with a nobody like me. Finally I asked, "Why me, Luca?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me for a long time, as if searching for words that didn't exist. Then he said, "Because when I'm here with you, I forget who I am." The words hit me harder than I expected. Part of me wanted to believe him. Another part screamed that this was wrong, that I shouldn't be here, that I was sitting across from the man my mother had spent her life fearing. But then he smiled, not the small, tired smirk I'd seen before, but a real unguarded smile. It was the kind of smile that made the world slow down. "I don't smile often," he said. "You've probably noticed." "I have," I replied softly. He looked down at his drink, swirling the glass slowly. "When I was younger, I thought power meant safety. That if I built enough walls, no one could hurt me again. But the truth is, walls just keep the pain inside." Something in his voice cracked. And for the first time, I saw not the feared name in the newspaper, not the man with blood on his hands, but someone who had been broken long before I met him. After dinner, we walked outside by the river. The city lights shimmered on the surface of the water, and the night air was cool, almost kind. He walked beside me, quiet, thoughtful, hands in his pockets. I said, "You don't seem like the kind of man who has peaceful nights." He smiled faintly. "Peace is overrated. You stop fighting, you stop surviving." "Maybe surviving isn't the same as living," I said. He stopped walking then, and turned toward me. His eyes, those cold, dark eyes, softened in a way that made my chest tighten. "I forgot what living felt like," he whispered, "until I met you." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was such a simple thing to say. But coming from him, it carried a kind of sincerity that scared me more than any threat ever could. When he drove me home, we didn't say much. I could feel the weight of everything between us, the truth I was hiding, the guilt he carried, the invisible line neither of us dared to cross. Before I got out of the car, he said, "Sophia." "Yes. If I ever stop coming to the diner, promise me you won't look for me." I frowned. "Why?" "Because some doors," he said quietly, "are safer left closed." He looked at me for a moment longer, then added, almost under his breath, "But if you ever need me, I'll find you." Then he drove away, leaving me standing under the streetlight with a heart that didn't know which side it belonged to, love or fear. That night, I sat on my bed, staring at the small silver locket my mother had left me. I hadn't opened it in years. But something about that evening, his voice, his story, his pain, made me want to see it again. I unclasped it slowly, my hands shaking. Inside, there was a tiny, faded photograph. A woman, my mother, smiling, holding a baby girl in her arms. And next to her, a man with dark eyes and a familiar scar on his wrist, shaped like a crescent moon. I froze. My blood ran cold. It was him. Luca, the man I had just shared dinner with, the man I had started to trust, the man who had destroyed my family. And suddenly, everything made sense. My mother's fear, the warnings, the nights she would wake up crying from dreams she never explained. He wasn't just part of her story. He was the story. I wanted to scream, to break something, to erase the softness I'd felt for him. But instead, I just sat there, holding the locket, staring at his face in that old photograph, and realizing that fate had played the cruelest trick of all. The man I thought I might be falling for was the same man I was raised to hate. But the heart doesn't care about the truth. It doesn't care about blood or revenge or the ghosts that live inside a name. And as much as I wanted to despise him, the truth was simple and unforgiving. I already loved him, and that love was going to destroy us both. Clapperboard Chapter 5, The Truth Beneath the Silence. Narrated by Sophia in first person. The night after I discovered the photograph, I didn't sleep. I just sat by the window, staring at the empty street below, watching the shadows stretch and fade with every passing car. My mother's words echoed in my head, warnings whispered between tears years ago when I was too young to understand what she meant. Never trust men who come from power, Sophia. Some smiles are painted over blood. I had thought she was talking about the world, about cruelty in general. But now, I knew she had been talking about him, the man with the crescent scar, the man who had taken everything from her, from us. And yet, I had sat across from him, smiled at him, felt something real for him. I wanted to hate him. God, I tried to. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, not the monster my mother described, but the man who spoke about loneliness as if it were a prison he had built with his own hands. The next evening, I went to the diner like always, though every step toward that door felt heavier. My chest ached, my palms trembled, and my heart was a war zone. I told myself I wouldn't talk to him, that if he came in, I'd hide in the kitchen, let someone else take his order. But the moment I heard the faint sound of the bell above the door, that familiar chime that always marked his arrival, I froze. And there he was, Luca. Same dark coat, same steady eyes, same calm that hid too much. But tonight, when he looked at me, there was something different, something tense, almost protective. He walked to his usual booth, sat down, and for a while, neither of us said a word. The diner was almost empty, just the hum of the fridge and the clatter of a spoon against glass somewhere in the back. Finally, he said, "You look tired." I forced a smile. "Long night." He nodded slowly. "You shouldn't work so hard." "I'm fine," I said quickly, maybe too quickly. But my voice betrayed me. He noticed. He always noticed. He tilted his head, studying me. "Something's changed." My throat tightened. "Nothing's changed." "Don't lie to me, Sophia," he said softly. "I can hear it in your voice." For a moment, I wanted to tell him everything. That I knew. That I'd seen the photo. That the man standing before me had once torn apart the only family I had. But then I looked into his eyes, and what I saw there wasn't guilt. It was pain. Deep, unspoken, human pain. He reached into his jacket and placed something small on the table, a folded piece of paper. "I need to leave the city for a while," he said quietly. "Things are complicated." I stared at the paper but didn't touch it. "Complicated how?" He hesitated. "There's someone after me. Someone who wants to use what I care about to hurt me." The irony was cruel, because what he didn't know was that the someone he feared was sitting right in front of him. I wanted to ask him why. Why had he done it? Why my mother? Why all the pain? But I couldn't, because even if I asked, even if he confessed, what would I do? Hate him? Turn him in? Or worse, forgive him? He sighed and leaned back. "You don't owe me anything, Sophia. But if something ever happens to me..." He stopped, looked down. Then his eyes met mine again, softer this time. "Promise me you'll stay safe. Promise me you won't come looking. The same words he'd said before. The same warning that now sounded more like a goodbye. When he left that night, the diner felt emptier than ever. I picked up the folded paper he'd left on the table, hands shaking. Inside was a short note written in his careful, sharp handwriting. Sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to walk away from it. And below it, a single address. No explanation. Just a location scrawled beneath his name. I should have ignored it. I should have burned it. But my heart wouldn't let me. Because despite everything, part of me still wanted to understand him, to know the man behind the blood, behind the shadows and the silence. 2 nights later, I went to that address. It was an old, abandoned villa outside the city, half swallowed by ivy and time. The gate was rusted, the windows boarded, but inside there were signs of life. A lit candle by the entrance, a cup of coffee still warm, and then his voice. Low, controlled, dangerous. But when he saw me, it shifted, became something almost gentle. Sophia, what are you doing here? I could barely speak. You left this. I needed to see you. He closed the distance between us in 2 steps. His hand hovered near mine, but he didn't touch me. You shouldn't have come, he said, his tone sharp, not with anger but fear. I had to, I whispered. I need to know who you really are. He looked at me, and in that instant, I saw the war inside him, truth fighting with survival. Then he said, If I tell you, you'll never look at me the same way again. Maybe I already know, I said quietly. He froze. His expression changed, confusion, shock, realization all at once. And for a moment, we just stared at each other, the air between us charged, heavy with everything unspoken. Finally, he exhaled, stepped back, and said almost to himself, So it's you. My heart pounded. What do you mean? He shook his head slowly. I should have known. Your eyes, they looked just like hers. My breath caught. He knew. He knew. He turned away, ran a hand through his hair. Your mother was different. She didn't belong in my world. I tried to keep her away, but my enemies... He stopped himself, swallowing hard. I couldn't save her. Tears burned my eyes, but I stood my ground. You destroyed her, Luca. His voice broke. No. I destroyed myself the day she died. And in that silence, that awful, aching silence, everything I thought I knew about him shattered again. I should have hated him. But instead, I saw a man haunted by his own past, drowning in guilt he could never escape. And as much as I wanted to run, I stayed. Because the truth was simple, terrifying, and undeniable. We were both prisoners of the same story, bound by a tragedy neither of us chose. When I finally spoke, my voice was trembling. So what now? He looked at me, eyes wet, voice raw. Now, he said softly, we both pay for the past. Clapperboard Chapter 6, The Night We Ran. Narrated by Sophia in first person. The night I learned the truth about Luca, something inside me broke, but something else awoke, too. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. It was the quiet, terrifying realization that our lives were now tangled beyond repair. When I left the old villa that night, the streets were empty, silent except for the whisper of rain starting to fall. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow felt like a threat. Because if what Luca said was true, if there were people hunting him, then coming here had just painted a target on my back, too. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My thoughts kept looping between my mother's face and his voice, that mixture of guilt and tenderness that made me doubt my own anger. I wanted to believe he was lying, that the story he told about my mother, about his enemies, the betrayal, the loss, was just another manipulation. But deep down, in a place I didn't want to admit existed, I knew he was telling the truth. And I hated myself for believing it. 3 days later, he showed up again, not at the diner, but at my apartment. It was almost midnight. I had been sitting on the couch with the lights off, trying to disappear into the dark, when I heard the knock. 3 sharp, deliberate taps. I opened the door to find him standing there, rain-soaked, tense, eyes darting over his shoulder. Luca! I whispered. He pushed his way in, locked the door behind him, and said quietly, They found me. My blood ran cold. Who? The men who took everything from your mother, he said. And now they want you. He turned toward me, his hand trembling slightly as he spoke. They know you're connected to me. You're not safe anymore. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. What are you saying? I'm saying we have to leave. Now. I should have refused. I should have screamed at him, told him this was his fault, that all of it, every bit of pain, began with him. But instead, I grabbed my bag, my mother's locket, and followed him out the back door. We ran through the alleyways, past the flickering streetlights, until we reached his car, that same dark, expensive car I'd once thought made him untouchable. Now it looked like a coffin on wheels. He drove fast, too fast, the city shrinking behind us like a memory we couldn't return to. I watched his hands grip the wheel, the veins on his forearm tense, his jaw tight. Every few minutes, he checked the rearview mirror. Where are we going? I asked finally. There's a safe house, he said. Outside the city. No one knows about it. I didn't respond. I just stared out the window, watching the rain smear across the glass like tears that didn't belong to me. We didn't speak again until the car stopped. The place was small, a cabin hidden deep in the woods, almost invisible beneath the trees. He turned off the engine, and the silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it could crush us both. Inside, there were only the basics: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a single lamp that flickered when he turned it on. He took off his coat and tossed it aside, pacing the room, rewriting the story to make himself the victim. But his eyes, they didn't belong to a liar. They belonged to a man haunted by every choice he'd ever made. So you didn't kill her, I said quietly. He shook his head. No, but I might as well have, because it was my world that killed her. My choices. My name. A lump formed in my throat. I wanted to hate him for what he'd done, for everything that had followed, but all I felt was sorrow. A deep, hollow sorrow that belonged to both of us. Hours passed. He drifted in and out of sleep while I kept watch by the window, the forest still and wet outside. Every rustle made my heart race. I didn't know if the men who chased us were still out there, but I knew they wouldn't give up easily. At one point, he woke and said softly, "There's a bag in the car. Under the seat. Bring it." I hesitated. "It's not safe. It's more dangerous to stay blind," he replied. So I went. The woods were eerily quiet, my shoes sinking into the mud as I made my way back to the car. Inside, under the seat, I found a black leather bag. It was heavier than I expected. When I unzipped it back in the shed, I froze. Inside were stacks of documents, a gun, and several old photographs, some of my mother, some of Luca, and one of them together. Smiling. Happy. But there was another photo, too. A man I didn't recognize. Tall, sharp eyes, a scar across his jaw. "Who's this?" I asked, showing him the picture. Luca's expression hardened instantly. "That's the man who ordered the hit on your mother." My blood ran cold. "He's still alive?" "Yes," Luca said, his voice darkening. "And if he finds us, neither of us will be." Silence. Heavy, suffocating. Then I said the words I'd been too afraid to speak. "Then let's finish this." He looked at me like I'd said something impossible. "You don't know what you're asking for." "I know exactly what I'm asking for," I said firmly. "You've spent your life running from what you did. Maybe it's time to face it. For her. For both of us." He stared at me for a long time, and I could see the conflict in his eyes, the instinct to protect me fighting against the part of him that knew I was right. Finally, he said quietly, "You're your mother's daughter." "Then help me make this right," I whispered. He closed his eyes, exhaled slowly and nodded. That night, we made a plan. It wasn't perfect. It was dangerous, desperate, reckless, but it was all we had. We'd go back to the city, find the man in the photograph, and end this before he found us first. Before dawn, I cleaned Luca's wound one last time, bandaged it tightly, and packed the documents. When he looked at me, his gaze had changed, no longer seeing me as someone fragile, someone to protect, but as someone standing beside him. He said softly, "If we do this, there's no turning back." I met his eyes. There never was. As the first light of morning touched the trees, we stepped out of the shed together. 2 broken souls bound by blood, guilt, and something that felt dangerously like love. I didn't know if we'd survive what was coming. But for the first time, I wasn't running anymore. I was walking straight into the truth. And somehow, that felt like freedom. Clapperboard Chapter 8, The City of Shadows. Narrated by Sophia in first person. The city looked different when I came back. Maybe it was because I'd changed, or maybe because I was finally seeing it for what it really was. A place where beauty and danger lived side by side, where every shadow hid a secret and every light carried a price. We drove in before dawn, the skyline still veiled in fog. Luca was silent beside me, his face pale but determined. His wounded shoulder was healing, but slowly. The pain was etched into every breath he took. And still, he didn't complain. Not once. I parked the car at an abandoned garage downtown. From there, we'd walk, quieter, safer, invisible. The plan was simple, but the simplicity made it even more dangerous. Find the man from the photograph, Victor Caruso, and end what he started 20 years ago. The streets were almost empty. The city was waking up, unaware that 2 ghosts had just returned to settle a debt written in blood. As we walked, I felt my mother's presence, not haunting me, but guiding me. Like she was there, in every breath of cold air, in every memory I was brave enough to face. I remembered being a child, hiding under the table at the diner while my mother cleaned late into the night. The smell of coffee, the sound of rain tapping the windows, her voice humming softly. I thought she was just tired, overworked. But now I knew better. She wasn't just surviving, she was hiding. Hiding from Luca's world. Hiding from Victor. Hiding from the truth that had followed her even after she ran. We stopped at a small diner near the river, the kind of place where no one asked questions. Luca needed to rest, and I needed to think. The waitress brought us 2 coffees and disappeared without a word. Luca stared at the cup for a long time before saying, "If this goes wrong, you leave. Promise me." I shook my head. "No. Sophia." I said no. I interrupted. "You had your chance to run, and you didn't take it. I won't either." He looked at me then, really looked, and something in his eyes shifted. Respect, maybe. Or regret. Or both. "Your mother would have hated me for bringing you into this," he murmured. "Maybe," I said. "But she also would have told me to finish what she couldn't." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hurts more than it comforts. "You're too much like her." "Then maybe you should stop underestimating me," I replied softly. By mid-morning, we reached the warehouse district, the kind of place where people disappeared and the police didn't ask why. Victor's men used to operate there years ago. If he was still alive, still moving pieces in the dark, this was where we'd find a trace of him. Luca led the way, his steps cautious but sure. He knew these streets like a map of his sins. And I followed, my heartbeat steady, my mind sharper than it had ever been. We entered one of the old buildings, empty except for the echoes of the past. Dust, rust, the scent of oil and old blood. "This was the place," Luca said quietly, "where I told your mother to run." I turned to him, "And where she never came back." He nodded slowly. "I waited for her that night. I thought she'd forgive me, that I could fix everything. But Victor found her first." My stomach twisted. "Why didn't you kill him then?" "Because I was a coward," he said. His voice cracked on the word. "And because killing him wouldn't bring her back." We found a small office in the corner of the warehouse, papers scattered everywhere. Some were old, faded with time, but others looked recent. Invoices, shipments, bank transfers under false names. And then I saw it, a photograph pinned to the wall. It was me, taken from the diner, weeks before all of this began. My blood ran cold. He knew who I was. Luca came closer, his face turning to stone. "He was watching you. Watching us." "Why?" I whispered. "To hurt me," Luca said bitterly. "To remind me that I could never escape." We heard footsteps then. Soft, slow, coming from the hallway. Luca reached for his gun, motioning for me to stay behind him. But it was too late. The door creaked open, and a tall figure stepped inside. Victor Caruso. Time stopped. He was older than in the photograph, but his presence was even more terrifying, calm, precise, like a man who had waited years for this moment. "Well," he said, his voice smooth as glass, "if it isn't the ghost and the girl." Luca raised the gun. "It's over, Victor." "Is it?" Victor smiled faintly. "You've been saying that for 20 years, Luca. Yet here you are, still bleeding for the same woman." I stepped forward. "You killed my mother." His gaze shifted to me, sharp, assessing. No, my dear. Your mother killed herself the moment she trusted him. The words hit me like a knife. Luca's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. His silence said more than any denial could. Victor circled us slowly, his hands behind his back. You see, Sophia, love is a dangerous weakness. It makes men like Luca predictable. It makes women like your mother disposable. Stop, I said, my voice trembling with fury. Or what? He mocked. You'll shoot me? Do it then. Show him what kind of woman he raised. I froze. My hand was shaking, the gun heavy in my palm. Luca's voice broke the silence, low, hoarse, desperate. Don't, Sophia. Why not? I shouted. He destroyed everything. Because if you pull that trigger, Luca said, stepping toward me, you'll never come back from it. Victor laughed softly. She's her mother's daughter. Of course she will. And in that moment, with the echo of his laughter, with the truth burning in my chest, I understood something. He wanted me to kill him. Because if I did, I'd become exactly what he said I would be, another broken soul molded by revenge. So I lowered the gun, slowly, and said, No, I won't give you that. Victor's smile faded. Then you're weaker than I thought. No, I whispered. I'm just done letting men like you decide who I am. And then Luca pulled the trigger. The sound shattered the silence, sharp and final. Victor fell, eyes wide, mouth open in shock, and then he was still. For a long time, neither of us moved. The air smelled of gunpowder and rain. When Luca finally spoke, his voice was quiet. You shouldn't have seen that. I turned to him, tears burning my eyes. You didn't do it for revenge, did you? He shook his head. No, I did it to free you. We left the warehouse as the sun broke through the clouds, casting light over the city that had once belonged to the dark. I didn't know what would come next, whether we'd survive, or if the world would ever forgive us. But as I looked at Luca, limping beside me, I realized something. The past doesn't disappear when you face it. It just loses its power to control you. And maybe that was enough. Clapperboard Chapter 9, What Remains After the Fire. Narrated by Sophia in first person. The city didn't burn that night, but something inside me did. When the shot echoed through that old warehouse, it wasn't just Victor who fell. It was every illusion I'd ever had about good and evil, justice and mercy. The silence that followed was deafening, like the world had stopped just to watch what we'd become. I remember the smell of smoke and rust, the weight of the gun in Luca's trembling hand, and the way his eyes looked at me, not with victory, but with loss. We didn't speak. We just stood there, surrounded by the ghosts we'd created. Finally, he dropped the gun. The sound of metal hitting the concrete was the only thing that moved me. He whispered, almost to himself, It's over. But it didn't feel over. It felt like the beginning of something darker, the part of the story where the price of truth comes due. We drove out of the city before dawn. Neither of us said a word for miles. The radio was off, the world outside a blur of gray and gold as the sun tried to rise through the mist. Luca's hand rested on the window, his knuckles white. I could see he was fighting something. Not regret, not guilt exactly, but the realization that he'd crossed a line he could never step back from. I wanted to tell him it was okay, that Victor had deserved it, that he'd saved us both. But deep down, I knew that killing Victor wasn't justice. It was survival, and survival doesn't erase the blood. When we reached the coast, we stopped. There was an old pier there, half collapsed, rotting, abandoned like everything else in his world. The sea was calm, but endless. It felt like standing on the edge of a confession. I walked to the end of the pier, the wind cold against my face. For the first time in years, I could breathe. No one was chasing us. No one was watching. Just me, Luca, and the horizon. He joined me, slower now, his body weakened from the wound, his steps heavy with everything he'd done. Do you ever think about what comes after all this? I asked softly. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, People like me don't get an after. We just get whatever's left. And people like me? I asked. He looked at me, eyes full of something fragile. You get to start over. I shook my head. Not without you. He smiled faintly. You shouldn't say that. Why not? Because I don't deserve to be part of your beginning, he said. Only your ending. I turned away, tears stinging my eyes. He didn't understand. I wasn't trying to forgive him. I wasn't even trying to love him. I just didn't want to lose the only person who had ever told me the truth, no matter how much it hurt. You once told me, I said quietly, that my mother saved you. Maybe that was her way of saving me too, through you. He shook his head. No. She saved me from myself. You saved me from believing I couldn't be saved. For a moment, we stood there, both of us silent, both of us knowing that words could never fix what time had broken. But they could make it bearable. And maybe that was enough. We spent the next few days near the coast, in a small house that belonged to one of Luca's old allies, a man who owed him enough favors to keep our names out of the papers. Every morning, I'd wake to the sound of the ocean, and for a few brief seconds, I'd forget everything. Then I'd hear him coughing in the next room, the echo of his pain reminding me that some wounds never really heal. He was getting weaker. The shoulder wound had gotten infected despite my efforts. He tried to hide it, but I could see it in his eyes, the fever, the exhaustion, the quiet acceptance. One night, he sat by the window, watching the waves crash against the rocks. He said, "You know, I used to think love was something people like me couldn't afford. Too dangerous, too unpredictable. And now?" I asked. "Now I think it's the only thing that ever mattered." I sat beside him, resting my head against his shoulder. His body was burning with fever, but his hand was warm and steady as it found mine. He whispered, "If I don't wake up tomorrow, promise me you'll live." I looked at him, my voice breaking. "Don't talk like that." "I need to," he said softly, "because if you spend your life chasing ghosts, you'll never see the sun again." I wanted to argue, but instead I just nodded, because I knew he was right. That night, I stayed awake long after he'd fallen asleep, listening to his breathing, counting every rise and fall of his chest, terrified that each one might be the last. And just before dawn, I realized something that both broke me and set me free. He wasn't dying from the bullet. He was dying from the years of carrying guilt that no one could survive. When the first light touched the horizon, I turned to look at him. He was still, peaceful, almost smiling. Luca Moretti, the man the world had called a monster, was gone. I buried him near the edge of the cliff where the wind met the sea. No name, no marker, just a single white stone. I stood there for hours, listening to the waves, the gulls, the quiet hum of the world moving on. And for the first time in my life, I felt something like peace. Because even though he was gone, his truth remained. And so did I. I walked away that morning with the sun at my back and the weight of his story in my heart. Not as his punishment, but as his promise. Because love, even the kind born in darkness, still has the power to set you free. And that was the only truth worth living for. Clapperboard Chapter 10, The Secret That Set Me Free. Narrated by Sophia in first person. It's been 3 years since that morning by the sea. Sometimes, I still wake up thinking I can hear the sound of his voice, that low, rough whisper saying my name like it meant something sacred. But when I open my eyes, there's only silence. The kind of silence that doesn't hurt anymore. The kind that reminds me I'm still alive. After Luca died, I disappeared. No one came looking. Not the police, not his men, not even the ghosts we left behind. The world simply moved on. And I let it. I sold the car, took the cash he'd left hidden in the false bottom of his bag, and found a small town by the coast where no one asked questions. There, I rented a room above a cafe and started working again, serving coffee, washing tables, watching people laugh without knowing how fragile happiness really is. Funny, isn't it? After everything, I became what I'd been at the beginning, a waitress. But this time, it wasn't to hide. It was to live. The first few months were hard. Every face that came through the door reminded me of someone I'd lost. Every sound, a car engine, a door closing, the click of a lighter, sent me spiraling back to that warehouse, that night, that shot. But grief changes shape with time. It stops screaming and starts whispering. And somewhere in those whispers, I found a new rhythm. I planted flowers by the window. I learned to smile again, even if it felt strange at first. And slowly I began to write. Not for anyone to read, just for myself. Pages and pages of memories, of truths too heavy to carry in silence. Luca's story. My mother's story. My own. One day I received a letter. No return address. No name. Just my first name, Sophia, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside, there was a single photograph. Old, faded, torn at the edges. It was my mother, younger, radiant, standing beside a woman I'd never seen before. And on the back, in my mother's handwriting, were 3 words. She saved me. I turned the photo over again, studying the stranger's face. Her eyes looked kind, familiar. And then I saw it. A small tattoo on her wrist, the same symbol I'd seen once on Luca's hand. My breath caught. It wasn't random. That woman had been part of his world, which meant my mother hadn't run from Luca. She'd run because of someone else, someone trying to protect both of us. For days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Had Luca known? Had he lied to protect me? Or had he been just as blind as I was? I'll never know for sure. But something in me changed when I realized that my mother hadn't died because of love. She died because she refused to surrender to fear. And that truth, that quiet defiance, became the foundation of who I am now. Sometimes, after closing the cafe, I walk down to the beach and sit by the rocks. I talk to the sea like it's listening. Maybe it is. I tell it about my day. About the old couple who comes in every morning and shares 1 cup of coffee between them. About the kid who wants to be a writer. About how the world still finds small ways to be beautiful, even when it's broken. And I tell it about Luca. Not as the man the world feared, but as the man I knew, the one who carried his sins like stones in his pockets, and still found the courage to love in the middle of all that darkness. I don't pray for him. I don't need to, because I think he found his peace long before the bullet ever took him. A few months ago, a journalist came through town. He was writing a book about organized crime, about redemption, about love, about the things people do to escape the past. He asked if I'd ever met anyone like that. For a moment, I almost said his name, almost told him everything. But instead, I smiled and said, yes, once. And that was enough. I still keep the photograph of my mother on the table beside my bed. The edges are worn now, the ink fading. But her smile hasn't changed. Sometimes I think she'd be proud of me. Not because I survived, but because I finally understood what she'd been trying to teach me all along. That love is not weakness. That truth, no matter how painful, is still worth chasing. And that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing to live anyway. Tonight, the air smells like rain again. The waves are calm. The moonlight dances on the water like it did the night he died. And I realize something I never had the courage to admit before. I loved him. Completely. Foolishly. Forever. But love doesn't always mean holding on. Sometimes, it means knowing when to let go. So, I whisper his name one last time into the wind, and it carries away, somewhere beyond the sea, beyond memory, beyond fear. And for the first time since that night I smile. Because his secret, the one that could have killed him, didn't destroy me. It saved me.